Everybody. This is the March 11th, 2021 meeting of the Parents Advisory Council. As we like to say around here, the PAC is back. And so it's springtime. There's a lot of reasons for being optimistic. It's been a while. It's so good to see the Parents Advisory Council again. And actually, I think we have a lot of important information for our school community this evening. So I think without any further ado, I think we all know everyone here, but I would like to introduce a new member of the PAC, Lisa Kennedy. Lisa, do you just want to introduce yourself to the group here?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lisa Kennedy. My daughter Sophie is a fourth grader at Blue Creek, and my son Benjamin is in kindergarten at Blue Creek. And thanks for welcoming me.
Well, it's good to have you here. And I think, for those who haven't been with the PAC is a group of members of our school community, parents who come together and join together with us, and they provide advisory. They serve in advisory capacity to the district to provide input on school procedures, practices, and policies. And needless to say, during the time of the pandemic, and in particular with the reopening, the input of the PAC has been really instrumental and key in helping us navigate through these difficult times. So Jane, without any further ado, let's bring up the presentation. And so here we are. And so let's go to the first slide with the agenda. So what I'd like to do is to review COVID-19 in North Colony by the numbers. And we have some very interesting charts and graphs that kind of surveys the state of affairs with regard to COVID-19 in the district. We will, Ms. Skeels will review the revised Albany County Department of Health guidelines for quarantine. We will have a number of individuals talk about planning for the remainder of the year. We will be talking about end of year. We'll also be talking about events that have been going on and will be going on, some plans for music education, some plans for physical education and athletics, talk a bit about our planning for next year, and Mr. Hoot and I will talk about our budget updates. So let's go to the first slide, please. And so this is the year that has been. We're going to take a look at North County by the numbers, and we're going to take a look at district COVID statistics. So if we could bring up the first chart. And I think this is a very revealing chart. So Ms. Bongermino, do you want to comment here on these charts and graphs, please?
Sure, Mr. Kaur, thank you very much. So we were looking at some of the COVID data and trying to do some comparisons to see how we were in relation to the county. That's what this first graph is. So this is by month, and in red you can see the average positivity rate of COVID cases in Albany County, starting at a low of 1% back in September and spiking to a high of 8.2% in January and then trending down. And in the blue, you can see what North Colony's experience has been as far as the positivity rate of our population, both in person and remote, for that same period of time. And again, our trending looks relatively similar as far as lows in September, spiking in January. But the difference between the county's positivity rate for that whole population and the district's population is significantly lower. So when we talk about, how safe is school and how are the kids doing and how are the adults doing as far as being COVID positive, you can really see that our rates are much lower than the overall county for that period of time.
And I think it's important to note that at the height of the surge, we were still at well under 2% positivity at that time. So I think this is, a very informative graph for us. It takes us up through the end of February. It does not include the time that we've been in school in March right now, but I think it is an excellent overall comparison. If we could look at the next set of graphs, please.
Oh, back one. Yes. Okay. So then we said, okay, well, let's delve into what's actually happening at North Colony. And so first we looked at this by level. So this is based on school building. So first we have our district-wide staff, which is 192 people. And these are people that are not assigned a specific building. So these are our transportation department, these are our maintenance employees, central office, those types of folks. And we looked at the number of cases in that group as a comparison of the overall population. So for our district-wide staff, we had an 8.3% positivity rate. But again, the population itself is so small that certainly the percentage is going to trend higher, even if you have just a few cases. And then at the 712 building, we had 135 cases out of an overall population of 3,306. And that includes both in-person and remote staff and students, for a positivity rate in that building of 4.1. Going to 4.6, we go down to 3.1% with 47 cases. And at K3, 3.5% with 72 cases with a population of 2,068. So overall for the district, we had 270 reportable cases, both in-person and remote, for an overall percentage of 3.8% of our population. And that's from September and through February.
Thank you. Let's look at the next chart, please.
So then taking even a deeper dive, we wanted to see, well, how are we doing at each level per month? So we had very low in September. I think we just had one case at the high school. And then we started to see somewhat of a surge in the K3 buildings. Then in December, 4-6 kind of took over. January was really a lot of sibling cases. So we had maybe a student at K3 that was positive, but had a sibling either in 4-6 or 712. And so we had a lot of sibling clusters of positivity, and then a decline down into February. But this is again by grade level and still staying under that 2% mark by month.
And let's go to the next slide, please.
And then last, we had some folks inquiring, well, how do we do in-person positivity versus remote positivity? And again, so in the blue is in-person and remote is in orange. Again, staying under that 2% mark, but we definitely did have positivity in the remote, which again is showing that, COVID was out there. And even though we did have it in person in school, we also did have a remote population as well. But again, numbers are trending down, and we are very excited about that. I can tell you.
So I think it's important to note, and I'd like to bring in Ms. Skeels on this, because Ms. Skeels does all our tracking, our contacts with the Albany County Department of Health, and also records daily on our dashboard. So, I think it's important to note, and Ms. Skeels will amplify this as well, that what you're seeing on these charts when we look at percent positive versus remote may not match up, and the numbers may not match up with what you see on the New York State dashboard. And Ms. Skeels, do you want to offer our PAC an explanation of why that is the case?
Sure. So the chart you're looking at right now is the actual total of students or staff members. All of them were students and staff. But in-person is a student or a staff member who has selected in-person learning as their primary option. Remote is obviously a student or staff member who is in remote instruction and has chosen that as their learning platform. The reason, if you were to look like the Times Union tracks statistics, if you were to look at our remote statistics in the Times Union, it looks a lot higher. And it's not that the Times Union is getting anything wrong. They're taking the data from the state dashboard. The interesting thing about the state dashboard, which I had mentioned in a previous PAC, but it's worth saying again here, is once the school goes into remote, even if the student was in person and in person at a time when he or she may have been contagious, I can't record that case as an in-person case. It locks out because let's say this child was in on a Thursday and on Friday we were remote. And so on Friday, I'm trying to report that child who was positive on Thursday in school. But on Friday, the first thing I have to fill out is that the school is remote, and then it automatically defaults to 0 students in person. Fair enough, there were 0 students there. We were in remote. But then if I go to report the case, it also zeroes out an in-person case. And because I have to report it, we were directed to just report it as a remote case. So the statistics will look different. These are our actual statistics, really reflecting whether children were truly in person or remote, or staff was truly in person or remote.
Thanks, and I think that's that's an important point to clarify, because individuals who would go to the dashboard might find some discrepancies there. So thank you for explaining that. Ms. Bongermino, we're going to now talk about North County's surveillance testing program, and that'll be the next slide. So would you like to comment on that?
I would be happy to. It's a little wonky here, but so we decided that we wanted to do surveillance testing of our in-school population, both students and staff. And our target was to test 10% of the in-person population. So we surveyed parents to say, can we have your permission, and staff as well, to test? And then we took a random sample of the overall population, just pulling those that had said, yes, we would do it. So we grabbed 10% of the population, and we tested all buildings over a 5-day period using the rapid test kits that we have been, that we received. So in K3, we tested February 20, 21, and 22 at all 6 elementary schools. We performed 151 tests. At 4-6, we did that on February 26th, and that was 110 tests. And then we had February break, and then we came back and we did the 7-12 building over 2 days, and that was March 4th and 5th, 175 tests. So we tested a total of 436 individuals using these rapid tests, and absolutely every test was negative. So we were extremely happy about that. And I do want to just give it a shout out to our nursing staff, who were absolutely amazing. Just to see them in action when they were swabbing the children, especially at the K3 level, they were so wonderful, so supportive of the children. It just made my heart happy to see that. So I just want to say thank you to the nurses, and certainly Matt Stein and Dave Statlander. They did an amazing job. But we're very happy with the test results, and we feel that we have a good random sample of what was going on in the building at that time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for those graphs. Those were very illuminating. I think let's go to the next slide right now. We have one more set of data here. And North County faculty and staff vaccinated. So I want to make sure that they are based on voluntary reporting of information. This is on a not mandated reporting. And so staff are absolutely not required to report this information, but voluntarily individuals have reported this. There actually may be more individuals who have been in the vaccination process. So this talks about the process of vaccinating for COVID-19. We have defined process by any individual who has received an appointment for their first shot, has received their first shot, is awaiting their second shot, has received both shots and has received both shots, and is 14 days past the second shot, so is fully immunized. So these were the statistics as of yesterday. You can see them here right now. We have had a total of 757 out of 998 staffs somewhere along the process here, and that is 76% of our staff and teachers, 77% of teachers, and 5% of the total staff vaccinated. So again, great news here for all. I just want to pause at this point in time and, for the PAC to see, are there any questions that anybody has at this juncture right now? I'm going to move to Ms. Skills to talk about the revised quarantine guidelines. Before we do that, well, certainly if you wish to enter questions in the chat, feel free to do so at any time. So, Ms. Skills, would you like to talk about the revised quarantine guidelines?
Can we go to the next slide, please?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Sorry.
That's okay. So a couple of things have not changed, and we want to be clear about this. They haven't changed in the county, they haven't changed in the state, and they haven't changed in North Colony. And that is expectations regarding screening, masking, and social distancing. So we are still following the social distancing guidelines that were put in place right from the beginning of the year by the state health department, the 6-foot distancing. We are still requiring masks of all our students and staff, because we know that it is up to all of us to continue to contain this virus. And although things are looking so much better, we know that every time we feel like we get ahead of this virus, it kind of comes back. So we want to make sure that we're doing all the right things. Having said that, based on the lower numbers in the county, and we're talking about community spread here and the school district being a part of the county, Albany County has changed and relaxed some guidelines for quarantine, which is tremendously helpful to us, because that means that if someone does test positive, there aren't as many children who have to be out of school. So first of all, we'll talk about elementary classrooms. And in elementary classrooms where students are in the classroom for the entire day of the same class. So picture a first grade class and there are 15 children, but they are there all day. They are in that classroom all day long learning together, as they always would have pre-pandemic. One thing the county is looking at is the length of duration. So if there is a positive student in that class, they have been there for a long time. So regardless of where the kids are sitting, the county is still saying that they are likely to quarantine that entire class because of the duration, the amount of time that they were together. Now, when we look at other options, when we talk about secondary school, our secondary school classes are less than an hour long. So we look at distance, and we look at our students wearing their masks. That's a given, yes. Are their desks 6 feet apart? That's a given, yes. That's something we committed to right at the beginning of the year. So if it's less than an hour and they are 6 feet apart and everybody can confirm that they are wearing masks, we now go through everything with the health department. But under those conditions, I'm very happy to say we don't have to quarantine an entire class. Instead, we're doing a much more targeted look. We're looking at seating charts. We're seeing who is in proximity to the student or the adult who tested positive. If we look at contacts and the amount of time, if they don't spend more than 10 minutes within 6 feet of that person, then they aren't recommended for quarantine. And so we know our students are more than 6 feet away. Sometimes it might be that a teacher is working with a child more closely. So it takes us a little bit longer when we get a case, because we have to actually go through, make sure we're tracing to make sure we're paying attention to the length of time and the distance. But on the end, we're quarantining way fewer students because we're not taking whole classes out at a time. The other big piece is the school bus. So the county has been very clear from the beginning that with one positive on a bus, they are quarantining the whole bus. They have been very clear that that is the directive we shall follow, regardless of where the positive sat, regardless of how long the bus ride was. With these new regulations, we do have some more flexibility. So first, we have seating charts on our buses. So for the bus, we're looking at distance. So people who were more than 6 feet away, so if a child is sitting in the back, a child who's sitting in the front no longer has to quarantine. So we work with our transportation director, we look at our seating charts, and we determine who are those students who were within 6 feet. In that case, we do have to quarantine those students unless they have a very short bus ride. So we actually use the GPS to find out how long the positive student was on the bus. Maybe they're one of the last kids to get on, or maybe they're the very first kid. So we also have to look at the 10-minute rule on the bus as well. And if we are unclear, and if we don't know, and we can't determine who was where, we talk to the health department and they will most likely advise us to quarantine the whole bus. Thus far, we have not had to do that. So that's been tremendously helpful. As with everything with this virus, circumstances can change. The county can change the guidelines. We have done nothing throughout this entire pandemic but follow the advice of the county, and we will continue to do so. For our adults, as Mr. Kaur has said, for our employees who are fully vaccinated, which is defined as greater than 14 days beyond their second dose and fewer than 90 days, they do not need to quarantine as long as they are asymptomatic. And so that has also been helpful to us already. In a couple of cases, we've had a couple of adults who have been past their 14 days, and they would have been quarantined under old guidelines, and they no longer have to be quarantined. So this has been a great change. We've even referred to it as a bit of a game changer. It's allowing us to keep our kids in school, but in order for that to happen, the county rate has to stay low. So we all have to continue to do the good work we've been doing, social distancing, avoiding mass gatherings, and wearing our masks.
Could we see the next slide, please? So end of year events. So Mr. Murphy and the high school staff are here to speak about end of year events right now. I would say here's the lens through which we want to look at that. And Ms. Skills, I apologize. Thank you very much for your very clear explanation of quarantine. But, you know, in addition to this, what I'd like to say is with the end of year events, we are looking to how we provide opportunities for students and families to celebrate in our community and do it safely, in a safe way, as safest way as possible. We are always going to be focused on meeting the state and county guidelines, but in addition to that, our focus is on providing those opportunities for us to come together in the safest way possible within those parameters to celebrate. And we know that we do miss community at this time. So I want to emphasize that is our focus and that is our lens. So having said that, Mr. Murphy, the high school planning process has started, and, you know, actually you've been at it for quite some time. So please, let's go to the next slide here. And Mr. Murphy, can you speak to some of the events for the high school? And, you know, we can speak generically also about some of the other grades as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Kaur. And we have with us also Brian Spofford, who our Taft Hall principal, is going to be commenting. And I believe Crystal Fox has joined us, and Garrett Kuchar as well, two of our other building administrators. And, you know, we were talking about this the other day, and as we get in, you've heard about the fact that we're still continuing to follow really the same rules that we had since September for occupancy of our schools. And that includes Shaker High School, which we're very happy to share with our 7th and 8th graders. And it's very, I used the expression the other day talking about this, that it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day, because this time last year, unfortunately, we were just about to go out for a long period of time, March 13th, day I'll never forget. And we were heading towards very uncertain times, and yet we had the end of our school year coming up, which is a very important time, not only at Shaker High School, but all our schools, where we have opportunities for celebrations. And I know you're going to hear from our music plans with Mrs. Keogh and our athletic plans with Mr. Stein, and those are all big parts of our school and our larger community. So with that said, though, we did a lot of planning. Some of you may have had children that participated in last year's graduation, or may not have, or some of the virtual senior awards that occurred. Unfortunately, we were limited on proms, and a lot of that had to do with what we were being told. Mr. Kaur was in constant touch with Albany County Health Department, Dr. Whalen, and we really were receiving guidance as we move towards the end of the year plan. And that's a similar tack that we're taking this year, as Mr. Core and Ms. Scales have pointed out. We want to make sure that we're providing every possible opportunity for all of our students, but yet meeting the expectations of our health department. Last year, you may have even heard of a school in high school in Saratoga County that had a graduation plan that they suddenly had to change because it was not meeting those expectations. So with all of that said, I want to emphasize this evening to everyone that we are continuing to remain what I call fluid and flexible with the planning. And Mr. Core used a word earlier that I like and I use a lot, but that we have to be able to pivot. And so we understand that as we continue on, we're looking at some great opportunities. And Brian Spofford, who does a lot of this planning for the end of the year, has been doing a lot of research. And so we're trying to create a lot of possibilities for our students, seniors and others, as we go into the end of the year. For the last 2 months, the administrative team that I just mentioned, along with our teacher advisors, our senior class officers and student government, along with Key Club officers and other student leaders, have met, and we've been talking about graduation, but we've been talking about other events as well and what that means. It's such a strange year in that we still even have we have our reserved dates with the different prom venues that we had, because nobody wants, those venues don't want to say no and they don't want to give up. We're still scheduled. We still have a scheduled date with the Times Union. Right now, if we were graduating tomorrow, we couldn't go to the Times Union. We know that based on what the regulations call for. But again, we're keeping all of our options open. We also know that, for just speaking of graduation, that it could range from being back at the Times Union, depending on what's happening, back to maybe an on-school site. Last year, it was a graduation where the parents drove up, and there was some discussion among the community recently that we were planning on doing that. That's nothing further from the truth. We are keeping all possibilities open, whether it's being back at the Times Union, whether it's something that we would do on the football field, whether it be an opportunity if we had to go back to some type of staging. So that's where we are with just our planning and our seniors. It's been hard on all of our students, but I feel so much for our seniors, because they keep telling me in these meetings, they just want a chance to come together one more time and be together. They haven't had a chance to be together once this year, if you really think about it, because of our North and South cohort. So this is really something that I know that, they could just stand and look at each other in the parking lot if they could, and just be happy to have the 500 or so of them together to just recognize one another, because it's been two separate schools, honestly, with our two cohorts. We're also looking, though, we are looking at that closely. We're looking at how we might do senior awards. We continue to have all of our groups together, our advisor, Mrs. D'Artagnan, and we will deliver the senior awards in the best possible way. For those of you who may have had seniors last year, you may remember that not only were we not able to give the senior awards live, but we had to do a pickup for the awards at a later date based on parents driving up. I talked a little bit about last year, and going into the end of the year, I felt things were becoming more constrictive with the rules. I'm optimistic. I'm looking at the glass half full. I'm hoping that things will start. It seems like things are loosening up, whether it's because of vaccinations or just the spread being down. So I'm hoping that we'll have more choices than we did going into last year. The last thing I want to mention, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Spofford, is that but we do know that at some point we have to get to a final decision. And unfortunately, we can't just say to the June 25th, oh, great, Eureka, we can go to the Times Union. We have to, there's a lot of planning that goes in. There's competition for venues. There's competition for tents, if you're looking for tents. There's competition for stages, if you're looking for stages. And I hate to say it, but it's kind of like PPE when we first became aware of what the expectations were. Schools were very concerned, are we going to have enough? And that's what we're trying to do to order to ensure that we have ourselves best set up for our different events. So that's a little bit of our thinking, our planning, what we've been doing. I'll throw it over to Mr. Spofford if he has any further comments for us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy said it very well, and it certainly is a challenge planning for events in June when we don't know yet what the regulations for gatherings are going to be. The way we've gone about it essentially is just not eliminating any possibility. We understand that we are going to have to pivot and be flexible, but obviously there is a certain time that, that becomes more and more difficult. And specifically with reservations and rentals, that is difficult. We're planning events for hundreds and also thousands of people. The more grand, I think, the more difficult those rentals and reservations become. What we've done, we've made a lot of different reservations at different locales, hoping that the regulations will change to allow us to have events like I think the seniors deserve. So I think a lot of that is speculation on what regulations are going to be in June. A lot of the plans that we've been discussing now are not possible based on the current regulations. So we're hoping to trend continues and we're more able to host a large scale event. The main things we're focusing on, like Mr. Murphy mentioned, first of all is graduation. And then we also do want to have at least one event where the seniors are able to get together and see their classmates, obviously, before everybody goes off for the summer. And then also senior awards. The challenge is getting people together with social distancing. Obviously eliminates a lot of things that seniors want to do together. We're trying to work on what the seniors want, but also abide by the Department of Health regulations. So it has certainly been a challenge, but I would like to reiterate, no final decisions have been made. We have a lot of options and possibilities. Some of the possibilities Mr. Murphy and I just spoke about earlier today, and we're really excited for them. And we think they would be a lot of fun for the seniors. But like I said, we would need some of the gathering regulations to ease up for those to happen. So we're hoping this trend continues.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So I think, the message for all end of year activities is simply this, boiling it down. Flexible and fluid are the operative words. We are supposedly getting clearer guidance from a higher entity. That could be the New York State Education Department. It could be the New York State Department of Health. That would be specific to graduations and end of the year activities. I think Mr. Spofford and Mr. Murphy talk about, the need for that to be timely because, the notion of pivoting on a dime with a big event like graduation is not a reasonable expectation. So again, the notion of options, depending on what we can do at the time, will be very important. I think in terms of the venues, though, we know right now the Times Union Center is not a graduation venue. It's not a sports venue. It's a vaccination center. The high school administrators made inquiries into SPAC and were told that SPAC is kept at 50 people right now. So right now, we cannot host big gatherings. We can host limited gatherings, and you can see we can have 2 spectators per athlete for athletic events outside. But, we have limitations right now. Having said that, school personnel are realizing are hopeful that there will be changes in those that will allow greater flexibility and are considering plans that, would allow more participation in a safe, socially distanced environment. Of course, contingent upon the state of affairs with the pandemic and on guidance we received from health departments, New York State Education Department, and the governor's office. So I think there is a question here and just a comment here on outside lunch periods and moving outside in general. And I think, using the outside with the weather getting nicer is certainly, it's good for the spirit and it's good for disease control as well. So thank you. So let's go to the next slide, please.
Mr. Core, that was I just didn't move it along. We've covered that.
Okay, great. So let's go to the next slide after this. And so I'm going to cover winter high-risk sports summary. Mr. Stein is exercising his duties as an athletic director, and as a father tonight, we have a final wrestling match over at the high school. So this winter, we received in January the green light to begin girls and boys basketball, competitive cheer, ice hockey, and wrestling. There were positivity rates for COVID-19 that had to be complied with. And when Albany County went under that rate, which was under 4%, then teams were given the green light to begin practice and play. So during the course of this time, we had 2 teams in quarantine, but there was no further spread or further positives from exposure. Some athletes went into quarantine periods due to school exposures, but not team exposure. And all other teams competed for the entire season and schedule, and it was a positive experience for those teams. We only had one postponement for the entire season due to the fact that the opponent was quarantined. So let's go to the next slide, please. So right now, as of March the 8th, we began Fall 2 season, and that includes sideline cheer for the varsity and JV levels, girls volleyball, varsity JV and modified, and boys volleyball at the varsity and JV level. And we will have football at the varsity JV freshman and modified level. And we are also offering co-ed modified swimming. So these activities are beginning now, and that season extends through May 1. Next slide. And you can see those are the dates there. And our varsity level, we will have league championships. In the case of football, that will be the last 2 weeks of games. So 2 games. The number of games that we have, volleyball will be in the range of 13 to 16. Football will have 7 games. Modified swim will have 6 meets. Modified volleyball, 8 games. And modified football, 4 or 5 games. And modified volleyball and football, they will be primarily a 1-month season plus a little bit for the month of April. And, they are limited by virtue of facility restrictions. Let's go to the next slide. So in Fall 2, we will have pretty much the same policy that we had in Fall 1. We will use a badge system in the Suburban Council. Each Suburban Council player will receive 2 badges, and those badges must be presented by the parent or the adult who is with the child when the child plays. These badges have to be worn. They have to be visible. Spectators must be masked. Spectators must maintain social distancing. Spectators can basically meet their athlete after the contest outside the facility, and we're finalizing the spectator protocols for volleyball and they may vary due to the fact that this is an indoor sport. Basically, we can't have any spectators for modified swim. So they will also swim all their meets virtually. So they will swim the events timed, and then they will compare them to the other team. But we will live stream all the contests and all the meets. If you've had a chance to watch the live stream, it is very good. And we will, it is our intent to live stream every Fall 2 contest, and that's regardless of level. So if you go on the Shaker Athletics page, that's where you will find information on that. So let's go to the next slide, please. And so when you take a look at spring sports, and that's a season that starts May 1 and goes towards the end of June, we're offering boys and girls lacrosse, varsity JV and modified, baseball and softball, varsity JV and modified. Freshman and modified ninth grade is dependent upon the facilities and the availability of opponents. Boys and girls track at the varsity and modified levels, tennis at the varsity and JV level, and our unified basketball program. And the exact protocols for the spring are yet to be released by the New York State Public High Schools Athletic Association. And we will have spectator rules that will be addressed by the Suburban Council and by the district prior to the beginning of spring sports. Next slide, please. So moving from athletics, I would like to now introduce Deborah Keogh. Mrs. Keogh is our district supervisor of music. So welcome, Mrs. Keogh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaur, and I'm glad to be here tonight to talk about some changes in music. This question, now that sports are approved, what does this mean for music? I've been asked many, many times recently in the last few weeks, and especially by students, especially by senior students. So I do want to emphasize first, we definitely have music going on in our schools, and we certainly have all year, but there are some significant negative impacts on the students. One of them is that not all of our students are actually able to participate in every music class because of the distancing. New York State recommended 12 feet to sing or play wind instruments, and we have a 7th grade chorus of over 104 students. So with 52 students in one section of chorus in the largest cafeteria in the high school at 12 feet distance, they don't even fit. There is no room in all of our schools in the entire district to fit 52 students at 12 feet distancing. And so what we're forced to do is to have some students sit and, I don't know, play on their phones, supposedly do homework, while some of them get to sing. And so they take turns being able to participate. It's really not a good experience for our students. Second is that elementary students have not been allowed to sing. Being 6 feet apart in their elementary classrooms at their desks, I can't spread them out in the classroom with the number of students they have. And it's very hard to be a 5-year-old who just wants to sing all the time and be told, you're not allowed to. And finally, the worst part for me is seeing how isolated our students clearly feel. And they've told us, especially at the high school level, how isolating it is to be 12 feet apart in music. Imagine being that 7th grade chorus student and you're standing in the cafeteria. Each one of your peers is 12 feet, then 24, 36, 48 feet away from you. You are singing, and it really feels like you're the only one singing in front of all the other 12 and 13-year-olds in the room. And it's really a difficult experience for our kids. So none of these are positives, and all of these have been part of our COVID restrictions. We'll take the next slide, please. So last summer, when everything, or a year ago, when everything was crashing down, at some point over the summer, New York State Department of Health put together recommendations for schools, obviously, and we're well familiar with all of them. And in the absence of any information on what happens with COVID and singing and playing instruments, what does all this mean? New York State Department of Health made up 12 feet of distance for singing and instruments. I don't fault them at all. They had to come up with some kind of guidance that they believed was safe, and so they did so. Of note, though, when in the categories of activities that were listed as mandatory or recommended best practice, ensuring 12 feet of distance to sing or play with instruments was under recommended best practice. So unlike sports, music has never been prohibited. They just gave us guidance that suggested 12 feet was probably considered safe. Since then, it's been 10 months of research, it's been 12 months since all of this started. We actually have answers. So I'm going to present some of those to you tonight. Next slide. This, I showed the PAC at the end of last summer. This came out in the research in August, actually part of July, I think, and literally came out. Some of the research came out from an international study within 2 days of the State Department of Health information. So certainly the state had no opportunity to consider this information, but this is the data that the survey, the study came to realize is that in singing, you do release particles out of your mouth, aerosols. COVID is an airborne virus, we know. So when you're speaking, when you're coughing, when you're sneezing, when you're singing, some little droplet particles come out in the air from your mouth. And of course, that happens with singing. Singing without a mask was measured in the aerosol particle spectrometer, something none of us have in our homes. But they did in this study at the University of Colorado and then replicated at the University of Maryland. But you can see the little blip when you sing with a mask. Singing with a mask that's fitted well on your face takes away 92% of the particles that exit the mouth while singing. Next slide. In the last 10 months, this study went through every instrument that we use in all of our band programs. Obviously, string instruments, if you play in the orchestra, violin, cello, you don't blow in those. So they wear a mask. They have been 6 feet the entire time. But band instruments, we didn't know anything. Now we do. You can see from left to right the trombone without a bell cover. So a bell cover is essentially a mask. When I play trombone, and I do, and I love it, air is coming out the end of the instrument where it flares out. That's called the bell. And when that air comes out, you have to assume some aerosol particles may be coming out. So they measured for every instrument how much is actually coming out the other end. And then they measured it with essentially a mask for the instrument. So a mask, the bell cover, you can see with the orange blips how much that reduced the aerosols there. The trumpet had more aerosols. It's a smaller instrument and it has a lot more pressure when you blow into a trumpet, but you can see when you put a bell cover, essentially a mask on the trumpet, that the aerosols are so greatly reduced. The French horn had some aerosols coming out, but the French horn is a very windy instrument. Fun fact, if you took apart the French horn and straightened every tube, it's the length of a school bus. So by the time you put a bell cover on the end, almost nothing is coming out. And if we can show the next slide, I want to share with you the woodwind instruments. So these are instruments like the clarinet. You can see the gray blips there. And then when you put the bell cover on at the bottom of the clarinet, it's barely there. The saxophone, which is a very small amount of aerosol to begin with. It's very little air pressure. It's easy to get a sound on saxophone. And then when you put the bell cover on, the oboe was the worst offender. The oboe had the most aerosols coming from any wind instrument. And you can see the large spikes are reduced to 96% when you put a bell cover on. The flute actually surprisingly had almost no aerosols. There's no air pressure. When you blow in a flute, it just blows very easy. And so the researchers determined this by studying it. It was our guess. It would have come out the opposite, but in actuality, it wasn't true. And what I find the most fascinating about these instruments is that for each one, there are holes in the instruments besides at the bottom of the instrument. So if I play on a clarinet, I'm putting my fingers over holes in the clarinet. So I assumed a year ago that if I covered up, even if I covered up the bottom of the clarinet, aerosols would come out everywhere. Turns out they don't. They're very much directed by air. If you think about sneezing, how much air pressure is coming from your mouth and nose when you sneeze. Well, it turns out playing an instrument is very similar. A lot of it just goes directionally down, and therefore that's why a bell cover makes such a substantial difference on these instruments. Next slide. Finally, the CDC released guidance in February, on February 12th, and New York State schools were very excited to see this guidance And then it came and we said, yeah, 6 feet, masks, we know all this. Well, it turns out there was new information. There was new information for music, which had never been done before. CDC has never said a word about music, and this was new. They said, wear masks, students and staff. They said 6 feet apart to play an instrument or sing. They had the benefit, the CDC, by now in February 2021, of knowing all the research, knowing 10 months of research into COVID aerosols and performing arts music. And the New York State Department of Health a year ago obviously did not. This is new. They said, if inside, wear a mask for singing. We always advise when we have students and teachers, if you're going outside, keep your mask on. It seems like a safer thing to do. So I would say the same. Wear a mask to sing inside or out. And they said bell covers on the wind instruments to minimize the same, for the same purpose as we do when we speak or sing. So it's very simple. 6 feet for everyone, mask the singer, mask the instrument. That's the information here. Next slide. Finally, this is the difference it makes. Right now, we're at 12 feet of distance for band and for chorus district-wide. If we were able to move to 6 feet, these are all of the things that we could put into place right away. We can have full participation in those music classes like that 7th grade chorus where students signed up to be in chorus and they're not able to sing. They could. I can fit them in at 6 feet. We can sing at elementary schools, which would be fabulous for those young kids. That's what they're dying to do every day. They've been begging their teachers all year. We can decrease the isolation for the kids that they experience at 12 feet. Our students have gotten used to the 6 feet of distance in the classrooms. They found ways to chat with each other side by side at 6 feet even. But at 12 feet, it's silent. It's silent in the room. It's very, very unnerving, honestly, and depressing to see. We can do some special events too. Mr. Murphy and Mr. Spofford talked about the opportunities that our seniors would have and the experiences that mean so much to them. I know that our students who are seniors now didn't have a spring concert last year, and we could pull off a senior night. So imagine this wind ensemble. Like Mr. Spofford said, you know, Mr. Murphy, we have North kids, South kids. We could bring them in for a night. Like a concert, but it's not a concert. We'll call it something else because they've never actually played together. They've been North group and South group and remote kids. If we could offer to bring them in one night, put them at 6 feet distancing on the stage, and if it's possible, given the gatherings and regulations, to bring in senior parents. And we'll call it a senior night. We'll do sort of an open rehearsal. We'll practice the songs, get the best we can out of it, and perform them at the end of the experience for the parents, and do the celebrations that we do for the seniors. Stand up, get the applause they so deserve. I really will be excited if we can pull this off. I think it'd be a fabulous opportunity. Given that I'm talking about 11, 12, I'd like some opportunity for 9, 10 just to get together. Even if I can't bring in parents, just the opportunity for the kids to sing together, to feel like, you're right, this is what I signed up for. This is what I want. We could do some other fun, exciting things. If we have football games, then at Shaker High School, we could have pep band in the stands playing for the team. They'd have a blast. The kids are dying to do this. We could have a marching band night in the parking lot for the families. That would be fun. Shaker Select could sing live at graduation, wherever graduation is. Same with our high school wind ensemble. They can play the national anthem live. None of these things work at 12 feet. The Shaker Select kids won't hear each other in any space at 12 feet apart to have a live rehearsal without being in a small room where you can really hear. So these kind of experiences would matter a lot. On the younger students, for their experiences, they could actually have band. They signed up to be in band, and they're 5th graders who haven't done it yet this year. So being able to have an exciting day, we're like, finally, the Blue Creek Band gets to play. That's my big excitement. And some junior high special rehearsals that we can do. Finally, I do want to speak to the mental health of our students. We know, seeing all those news stories today is the 1 year anniversary. My husband and I were joking. We're like, I don't want to watch. It's like, let me watch some of the worst experiences I've had. I don't want to think about it right now. I want to move on. And our students have been really struggling with all of these experiences, all of this isolation. This is the time in their lives when they make connections to develop their own identity. And they've had no experience to do that, no opportunity to do that. And in all of these struggles and everything they've been saying, it's really, really frightening to think about their mental health, and to be able to make a difference in that is so important. Our kids' mental health matters as much as their physical health. Being a full human being and being able to move forward in your life is so critical. And I put the quote on the bottom because someone said that to me. With all of the challenges they were describing, all the loneliness, the despair, really, she said to me, I can get through everything else if I can just sing. So with that, this has been my recommendation to Mr. Kaur, and he has asked me to present the same to the Board of Education next week. And obviously tonight, I'm happy to share these recommendations with the Parent Advisory Council. Thank you, Mr. Kaur.
Thank you, Deb. Does anybody from the PAC have any questions for Ms. Keogh at this point in time? I thank you for that presentation. It's well reasoned and very well thought out. Thank you. Let's move to the next slide here. We're going to be talking about planning for next year. And so budgeting in the time of COVID-19. COVID-19 has also brought on a set of economic circumstances that, needless to say, are challenging for us as a nation and challenging for school districts. So we have been started our budget season. We've had 2 meetings so far. One of the key points that we emphasize in our budget process is we engage in mission-focused budgeting. And we focus our work in the budgeting process, which is really a planning process, on the mission statement. The top part is focused on our students, focusing on all students, focusing on providing them opportunity and support to engage in relevant, challenging work which contributes to their academic and social growth and development. So we focus on all students. We focus on the entire child, academically, socially, and emotionally. And the second part of this is a key point here, and that is that in education, we are a people-driven business, and so people deliver the high-quality education that our students deserve and need. And so we focus on the development of the collective capacity of our staff, our teachers, and administrators to provide that high-quality education for all our students. So let's go to the next slide, please. And we also are guided by the 3 pillars to guide our budget planning. And so I would like to turn this over to Ms. Skills right now, who will speak to these multiple pillars.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Kaur. So these pillars, if you have been through our budget presentations before, you know that these are always our 3 pillars: academic excellence, equity, and social emotional health. Perhaps they take on a slightly different rendering this year after the pandemic. So in terms of academic excellence, we start by looking at where our kids are and what they need, identifying and addressing continuity of learning, especially as we start bringing everybody back together. In terms of equity, we know that this pandemic has really shown us the lack of equity, not in schools only, but in our society. And so we really need to be thoughtful and innovative so that we can continue to promote excellence, but avoid opportunity gaps. And social emotional health. Our children cannot learn if their social emotional health is not taken care of. As Mrs. Keogh just said, as Mr. Kaur said about sports or music, they need to feel good and positive about what they're doing. And there has been so much loss and so much difficulty over this last year that it is really incumbent upon us to really look at everything the kids have managed to do throughout this time. They have learned strengths. Our teachers have learned strengths. We all have. And to focus on that and build up, not remediate down. And that's really going to be important as we move forward. And we can't do that if we continue to think that academics are on this side and social emotional health is on that side. They're completely intertwined. And we will be talking at a future PAC about some of the things we're going to be doing to address mental health needs, because for the kids who have disconnected, and they've disconnected at schools all over the nation, and families who have disconnected, to bring them back in, it's not just like we're going to say open in September and everybody's going to be coming running back. Some will, and that's wonderful. But we really need to be thinking about what the summer looks like and how we bring our students back to something that is relevant, meaningful, and engaging. And if we hit them right away with, you're behind in this, you're behind in that, you're behind in the next thing, we're going to lose them. That cannot be our strategy. And we'll be talking more about that at a future PAC meeting. Next slide, please. So what is academic excellence? Well, what have we learned about our own strengths, first of all, and our students' strengths and needs? And it's easy to think about just all the loss, but we really have to think about what it is that kids can do now. First graders can log into Google Classroom. There are amazing things where kids have learned to cope. Our kids are incredibly resilient. And so how will we move forward? By looking honestly at what worked, by asking our parents, by conducting some surveys, what worked and what didn't work in remote learning. You know, a year ago, we were thinking that COVID, was spread perhaps on services. We didn't understand where it was. Same thing, we started remote learning in one way and we've evolved. Same thing for brick and mortar learning. What did we learn? Some things worked really well. Zoom meetings work really well to get more parents participating, more people watching at night than who can come out necessarily to the auditorium at the high school. So how do we make sure that things that did work, we're prioritizing to keep those in place next year? We can't take a giant step back. So prioritizing curriculum and instructional practices that will best serve our students, and supporting our teachers and families for a new reality as we go to move forward. Thank you. Next slide. Equity, this is something I said at the beginning. The pandemic has intensified equity issues, not just in schools, in cities and states, all over the nation. Students always come in with various background experiences. No two children are alike, but the level of exposure to the virus, the level of exposure to economic anxiety varies widely among the students in our district. And that may lead to different students having different levels of anxiety, trauma, fearfulness, depression. We are aware our mental health team, is meeting about this. But how do we ensure that all of our learners are equally advantaged upon return to school in September? And how can we promote equity by prioritizing resources to serve our most vulnerable? How do we identify the most vulnerable? Because there are kids who may not be doing well academically, but there are kids who are doing, it looks fine academically, but they're still in trouble. They're still having a hard time. They're still missing a main part of their lives. We as adults, with all our life experience and all our coping strategies, have had a challenging year. Well, what if you've only been on this planet for 8 years or 10 years or even 16 years? You don't have a lot of life experience, and we have to be aware of that. And part of this is looking at, are there things that we used to do that have contributed to systemic inequities? Because suddenly a lot of things changed in the pandemic. We were able to go one-to-one for every kid. We were able to go to online instruction. There are things that we changed on a dime that we hadn't been able to change for years. So we have to keep thinking forward because that's going to be really important for keeping people positive. Next slide, thank you. And the big one, I know families know this. I know you see your children have ups and downs, and they are probably more pointed now in the pandemic than they are typically. Social emotional wellness and academic learning are absolutely interconnected. And one of the things we started talking about, and you heard it tonight, is it's our job as educators to buffer the traumatic effects of this crisis for all our students, but particularly our most vulnerable. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we make sure our schools are safe, supportive, inclusive, that we prioritize connectedness, shared experiences, relationship building. Some of our younger kids, they had half a year out last year. They've had part of their class in this year. We've got to spend time building trust and community at the same time as we're working on academics. We can't spend forever. We understand that. But we have to prioritize our humanity. And the second bullet is, I think everything we've talked about tonight, from what Rich and Brian talked about, there's a reason we want graduations. There's a reason why we want a senior picnic. We want celebrations. We want joy in our lives. That's one way to counteract. Now, we always have to do it safely. So to bring music back, it's not going to look like the musical pre-pandemic. It can't, because we can't do that safely. If we could, we would. But how can we bring it back in a way that we give kids the opportunity to have some agency, to have some hope? How do we bring back sports in a way? It's a really short season for some of these kids, but they're getting something. And that is how we have to approach next year. And if we only approach it like they're going to be way behind, this learning loss is terrible, oh my goodness, we're going to have them, doing 50 worksheets a day. We will not do that as a district. We know that that is not good instruction, because good instruction can't exist without taking care of our kids' social and emotional health. And that will be a whole school effort. That doesn't fall just to counselors and social workers. That will be all of us working together, because we adults have suffered too. And we need community and joy and levity. And that's why we're excited when we see the kids and they get to do these things. And that's what we're going to be planning on. We'll be talking more about that as the next few months roll out.
Ms. Giels, thank you for putting that excellent frame on our work for our budget here. We do have some questions in the chat, and I think I'd like to, Lisa has a question. Are we expecting an answer on Regents by the end of March? And we have had some answers on Regents. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Sure. So the Board of Regents is meeting next Monday and Tuesday. So that is March 15th and 16th. Right now, the Board of Regents is working with the federal government. As you know, the Board of Regents applied for a waiver to eliminate the 3 through 8 testing and the Regents exams for this year. That waiver was not granted to any state, so it's not like New York State didn't do a good waiver. The federal government has said that those tests will not count for accountability purposes. They will not be held against a student, a teacher, a school district. There won't be any good lists and bad lists of schools or anything like that. But they feel it's important to take the temperature, if you will, and see where kids are in their learning. We don't know what those tests will look like. Today, the state just opened up a survey for educators to talk about all the assessments we do, because it's a flawed assumption to assume that the only assessments of kids happen with a standardized test. We're assessing kids all the time. And so there's still an ongoing debate right now with the federal government. They're still trying to get these exams waived. If, however, the Regents have to happen, the state will be giving only the Regents exams that are required by federal law. So that is the Algebra Regents, the Living Environment Regents, or the Earth Science Regents, and the English Language Arts Regents exams. They are canceling all the other Regents exams, and even if these exams have to be given, they will not count as a graduation requirement for the students. So we're looking for more guidance to come out, but the state is still working to see if there's any middle ground that potentially all the exams could go away. So we do expect to hear mid to end of next week. And yes, I see there's a question in the chat as well. Will 6th graders get some type of moving up celebration? They were supposed to have this last year as 5th graders. So yes, last year was challenging, not just for the high school they were planning multiple graduations, but we also have graduations from elementary schools. So we are doing the same work that Mr. Murphy and his team is doing for high school. Mr. Kaur and I and Mr. Deneen are doing the same work with elementary principals to look at what can those celebrations look like. They are joyful. How do we do it in a way that is safe and yet still celebrates the achievements of our children? Obviously in a slightly different way to keep safety in mind, but yes, we are planning and more to come on those as well.
Ms. Skeels, I don't know. I started to type that response to Brett, and the strangest thing happened. My screen went completely black, and I had a panic that I had blown up the entire PAC meeting. So I'm back on right now. But I know Renee had a question, and I don't know whether Brett whether there were some other questions about social emotional health in the chat. Did you see those?
Yes, I did. And I did respond to some of those. Renee's question is also about some of the opportunities we can have for remote learners to have social interactions with their friends. And I know Mr. Deneen has been working on that as well, and having opportunities for students to be able to come in if there is a moving up ceremony, things like that, if families are comfortable. And we will work on that as well, because those students have had a long, challenging year, and they are absolutely entitled to the same kinds of end of year celebrations that other students are. Absolutely.
In fact, they are more than welcome to attend if there are any in-person activities, to attend those activities if they're comfortable with that.
Correct.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Skills. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay. So, when we plan for next year and we budget for next year, these are the fundamental the fundamental question is, and it's really multiple questions, but will we be required by CDC and the New York State Department of Health and the county to maintain 6 feet of social distancing? Will we be able to return to normal capacity with masks and other established procedures during the course of the pandemic? So hand washing, all the sanitation that we prescribe as well. And quite honestly, these parameters are the determinants of everything we do: scheduling, building assignment and configuration, transportation, and staffing. So if we are allowed to go back to normal capacity, and quite honestly, normal capacity is, we know the state of Massachusetts recently went to 3 feet, and there's some talk of some counties in New York State going to 3 feet, although I don't quite know how they would do that when the mandated guidance in New York State is 6 feet. But 3 feet, Ms. Scales had Mr. Kraft, our director of facilities, measure 3 feet in a normal size classroom, and that is 37 kids in a classroom. So most of our classrooms are far smaller than that. So if we return to normal capacity, we would certainly be better than the 3 feet that Massachusetts has adopted, and that the Academy of Pediatric Physicians recommended actually last summer. So in that spirit, however, we are remaining hopeful, and we will plan to return to school with normal capacity. And as I said prior to going on to this meeting, we will be prepared to turn on a dime and to make adjustments as needed. And that is also one lesson that we have learned during the pandemic. So let's now go to the next slide, please. And budget facts with regards to North Colony. We're low needs as a district. That's how we've been determined to be. 3/4 of our revenue comes from property taxes. 17.5% comes from state aid, and the balance from fund balance reserves and miscellaneous revenues. This state, even before the pandemic, faced a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall. It was $6 billion then. It's closer to $15 billion now. What is the difference? The difference is that this year, the state received significant federal funding, and that was in this school year, 2021. It's going to be an even greater amount in 21-22. And so that federal funding is good news. It leaves us with funding that is better than expected. It also raises an alarm bell out there, because in essence, what the state government did is they plugged their budget gaps with federal funding. And so you'll hear us talk about this during the next few slides. Our greatest fear is always of the fiscal cliff, which potentially could occur once this federal funding goes away. And that fiscal cliff is a very possible reality. So when we go to the executive budget, big picture, which is the next slide, this is the big picture. So the state has increased school funding by $2.11 billion. That's 7.1%. That's an increase in total funding. That sounds great. But actually what happened out there was a $607 million reduction in state funding. So we have never had a reduction in state funding. And that was offset by a $2.72 billion increase in federal support. So the state funding total also included the state program, School Tax Relief Program, STAR, and the local districts. There was something called the $1.35 billion local district funding adjustment, and that was taken against the STAR benefit, not school aid. The thinking being that the state constitutionally has to maintain its effort in funding schools. And if they took this adjustment or took this deduct against school aid, they would have been in violation of that. The basic or the foundation aid of aids given by the state, that is frozen for a second straight year. And the difference, one big difference that if it goes through would be a major shift. We have 11 aids that are based on expenses expended during the previous year, and then they are folded into next year's budget as a revenue line. This was always good because it was a predictable amount of revenue. These 11 aids right now have all been lumped together into something called services aid. A formula has been applied to them, and actually the amount that should have been allocated was cut by $693 million against our current law. North Colony, when we get to the slide which shows the services aid, it's going to show an increase of over $300,000, but actually that increase should have been closer to $600,000. So this is a concern for all school districts. The state did agree to partially assist with transportation aid. When schools shut down on March 13th last year, the state was going to assume that buses no longer transported students, and they were going to cut transportation aid accordingly. They have not done that because in fact, transportation departments were continuing to deliver meals, to deliver instructional supplies, to deliver technology. And, quite honestly, also, we were maintaining our fleet of buses. Now, our state budget assumes $6 billion in federal assistance. $15 billion was requested, and this was $6 billion was prior to the most recent federal assistant COVID relief package that was just passed by the Senate and the House and signed by President Biden. So could we go to the next slide? So the school aid proposals, this is a big one, merging the 11 expense-based aid. You see them there. The two top ones, transportation and BOCES aid, they are big, and lumping them all together is really, in essence, a major cut, and they wouldn't be expenditure driven. And so if we increased our expenditures in these categories, so for instance, you increase your use of BOCES. BOCES is a regional service, applies the power of 24 schools in this region towards purchasing. And, the incentive was that the next year you would get that back, aid back based on your aid ratio and how much you expended. That will be not true. Next slide, please. Any more? So our foundation aid remains flat. We did allow, as we said, for transportation aid, particularly for meals, instructional materials, and internet access. And then the STAR exemption was eliminated for new recipients. So the difference between the STAR exemption and the STAR credit was that when individuals hit for enhanced STAR, the age, which is 65, and the income level, which is a requirement for enhanced STAR aid, they used to get a deduct built into their school taxes. Now they will get a credit, which means they get their tax bill, they pay the full tax, and then they receive a check back from New York State. So that is a new shift there. Next slide, please. So right now, I will turn this slide over to Mr. Scott Hoot, who is our Assistant Superintendent for Business, to explain the 21-22 state aid per the executive budget and go line by line and reference that to 2021. Mr. Hoot.
Thank you, Mr. Core. And this chart represents all of the information Mr. Core spoke about in the previous slides, starting off with our foundation aid being flat for the second year at 12.1 million. The second line is the services aid, the 11 different categories of expense-driven aids that have been put together to create this new category. Again, these are proposals in the executive budget, important to keep in mind, and we'll see what happens as the budget moves through the legislative process. But that's what services aid would look like for North County for 21-22. Our building aid, fairly flat. That's related to all the projects that have been accomplished in the past, whether they are bond projects or the year in, year out cash projects that have taken place over the past few years. Reorganization incentive aid relates to the Maplewood Annex, and that is now coming to a close in 21-22 with the last payment of $285,000. The next two lines relate to costs associated with special education. And that is an expense-driven aid that has been left alone in a standalone manner to allow the funding to flow per the existing law and not lumped in with the services aid categories. The pandemic adjustment line, that's that $541,000 was an adjustment in the 2021 year. That's not being applied in 21-22, but rather a couple lines down. Local district funding adjustment is a new deduction that the state has taken from its funding obligations. So probably the best way to illustrate the state budget versus the federal dollars coming in is if you look at the state subtotal line, and you can see the reduction in state funding for North County of about 3.5 million, only to be offset by the COVID-19 stimulus dollars of about $5.6 million. And that 5.6 relates to the bill that was passed in December, not any current negotiations, or the bill rather that was just signed this week in relation to the $1.9 trillion, or what some of us call the stimulus number 3 package. So when we get to the bottom line, we're about $1.5 million to the good, all things considered, when we analyze the executive budget proposal.
So I think, when you take a look at the federal subtotal, absent that, it would have been a very grim picture for North County. the big question that every school district, all 700 of them in New York State, the question being asked is, what happens when the federal funding goes away? And we don't quite know what the impact of the second stimulus is yet. So let's go to the next two slides, talk about the preliminary tax levy limit and the tax levy cap. So I'll let Mr. Hoot explain those both, please.
Sure, Mr. Core. The always popular tax cap calculation. So this year, the 2% tax cap is not 2%. It's a function of the CPI. And this year, we are looking at 1.23% as the index that will be applied to the tax cap. Districts may have another factor that relates to the growth in property values. In our case, we have a 1.59% factor that will be applied in the formula, and that number is derived and dictated by the New York State Real Property Division, and it's provided to all districts in the state. The capital exclusion reduction relates to our debt service, our bus purchases, and the state aid that relates to our debt service, our building projects, and our school bus purchases. Pilots are another factor in the formula, and you'll see in the next slide the plus and minus that relates to pilots. Not a major item in the overall formula or district budget, but is a factor in the formula.
Pilots are payment in lieu of taxes, and regional development authorities can provide business entities with a payment in lieu of tax plan, usually over a period of 10 years, to attract them to come to build in a town or in a region. So let's go to the next slide, please.
So this chart then represents what we depicted on the previous slide. We begin always with the tax levy in the current school year at 88.2 million. We then apply that tax base growth factor. Then we begin to do the modifications of both plus and minus for the current year. The first being pilots, those payments in lieu of taxes at about $493,000 of revenue received in the current year. Subtract the capital exclusion in the current year. Again, that relates to debt service, school bus purchases, and the aid associated on capital projects and bus purchases. We then get to apply the levy growth factor, which again could be as great as 2%, but again in this upcoming year it's just 1.23%. And then in the bottom portion, those same pluses and minuses relate to pilots for the upcoming year and the capital exclusions for the upcoming year. We come down to a bottom line, which comes out at 1.57% for our tax levy limit as calculated preliminarily for our 21-22 school year.
So when we look at a tax levy impact, when we look at tax, the assessment growth of 1.59% offset against the cap of 1.57%, we are looking at perhaps about a zero or close to even tax impact for this year. So let's go to the next slide, please. So when we take a look at 2021 observations here, foundation aid remains the same. We were used up until last year to consistent growth in foundation aid. So we're consistently holding it flat now. That's a major change. $3.8 billion in federal stimulus, and that was the previous stimulus, the December stimulus. We are anticipating another round of stimulus, and that would have an impact on the schools. It's just that we don't know exactly how that's going to come to support us. So when we look at this stimulus of $3.8 billion to the state would have to come up with $3.8 billion to maintain funding for next year. That's questionable. I mentioned the latest stimulus package. What will be the impact? Preliminary indications would be that it would be very favorable. We don't know how it will be distributed. We don't know when it will arrive. And we don't know if it will be taken against another cut by the state. And the STAR cut is intended to be recurring. But again, what happens when federal aid is exhausted? And we are concerned very much about the loss of federal aid, the fiscal cliff that ensues as a result of that. So 5.66 million remains the number here for North Colony. If that's not replaced, that is a very major problem. So Brett put in the chat, I think once the economy starts rolling again and the sales tax revenues come back, things should hopefully stabilize. And I would say that is our hope too, Brett. So I hope that is the case. I hope that's true. And I hope that, when the stimulus carries us over to that time. So that is all of our hope. But we do have very, very grave concerns. So when we go to the next slide, closing gaps, we use attrition when we can to consolidate or not fill. And we look to contain expenditures. We look to seek reductions. And we look for sustainability. We consider redesign. In other words, spend less or spend nothing to use funds in different directions based on programmatic needs and needs of our students. And we reimagine, we challenge previous assumptions. That's part of the third bullet there, part of our restructuring. And we always look for opportunities to gain revenue. So this is our challenge each and every year with a budget. It's just far more acute this year. So at the end of the budget presentation, if we could go to the next slide, we always put this information up here, and you have it in the presentation we sent out, and we'll post this on our website. You can contact Assemblyman Steck or Senator Breslin. That's their email and their phone. And let's go to the next item here. And this represents our budget meeting calendar. So next Monday night, we have instructional technology. March 24 and 29 are big nights where we take a look at staffing, enrollment, and new programs. On the 12th of April, we have a review of the budget, and the board goes through budget section by section to vote on each of them. And then the board formally adopts the entire budget on the 21st of April, followed on May 5th by a public forum on the budget and a Meet the Candidates night and an annual election and budget vote, which occurs on that third Tuesday in May, and this year it's May 18. So any question on budget or finances before we go here? Could we go back to the group, Jane? Anybody have any questions here tonight? I know we've covered a lot of ground, but I would say that we are hopeful, and we are hopeful with the good weather and more sunshine and the ability to be outside and outdoors, that opportunities for students continue to grow and continue. So Lisa had one of the big questions on everyone's mind. She said,
Look at that, Lisa. You made Mr. Core freeze. Lisa's line was, "I'm that kid. I'm still holding out for a snow day." And we certainly can tell you that we have had many a time that next week of March where you think you're out of the woods, and then bam, you get one of those really big snowstorms. So,
Ms. Scales, if Mr. Core froze, does that mean it's a snow day tomorrow?
it could potentially be. I mean, Lisa might have a lot of power right here.
I went to Lemoyne College in central New York, and the first day of really, really nice spring weather, they had something called Dolphy Day that was unannounced, and you just woke up at 4:30 in the morning, and it was a day of just celebrating the sunshine after surviving central New York winter. So we can call it Bison Day, but I think our kiddos have missed out on a few, and if we could forecast so parents have a way to have appropriate childcare, it might be a way to celebrate, or the fact that we've made it through currently 364 days of COVID, because I believe tomorrow is the anniversary of the email from Mr. Core telling us that we were going to have a Superintendent's Day, and then free side effect there.
That was a good one. That is indeed correct. Yes, I believe that was our infamous Friday the 13th conference day, as I recollect. So very true indeed. And yes, Mr. Core is aware that there's still one hanging out there, but he also knows New York winter, so he doesn't want to pull it too soon, just in case we get a little true Mother Nature surprise. And I would say Brett has a question in the chat too that asks about the current fifth grade, who is obviously at the middle school now. If the middle school becomes a 6, 7, and 8, and they don't go back to their elementary school, will we have a ceremony for them? And we will absolutely have a ceremony for them as well. And we will work through that and plan that as we know, if we land on the fact that we're going to be able to reopen, and that's certainly our desire, our middle school as the 6, 7, 8 building it's intended, then we want all those kids to have those opportunities. Mr. Core, we had a lot of fun at your expense in your absence, all in good fun. We talked about Lisa having a lot of power to freeze you.
I just want to say right now, Lisa, I was not ducking your question by pretending to go dark here. You know,
what we talked about, you can go watch it back on YouTube later tonight.
That's right.
We made a few minor decisions on your behalf.
Yeah,
that's great. You know, it's good to know.
We're all looking forward to the snow day tomorrow, Mr. Core. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great. You know, we have one snow day left, so if it if it comes to fruition, it will be a real snow day. So that is my promise to you. Other questions? Something, this is not the IT staff's fault. Okay, the reason why I went blank is I thought I was plugged into my power source, and actually my battery ran out. And so, no, it's not an IT problem. It's a Mr. Core problem. So happens to the best of us in Zoom here. Sorry about that. Anything?
You made a quick recovery, Mr. Core. Quick recovery.
All right. Yeah. Great. I did. I thought. Anyways. So in any case, any other questions here? It really is great to see everybody again, and I really do have hope for the future and the spring. I think it's imperative now more than ever for all of us to stay safe and to to mask, to adhere to social distancing, to follow the guidance. And, we do it for each other. And that's who we are. We care. We are a caring community here in North Colony. By demonstrating that care, we, just provide great opportunities for everyone. So thank you. And, we had a very sad event this week as well. We lost a beloved member of the Southgate community, who was a pillar, a foundation, and a rock in that community, Mr. Peter Moralja. Thank you, Lisa. We do appreciate that comment of support for the Southgate community, and it was a tough loss for all involved. And we will miss him very much, very, very much. Anything else? Well, good to see everybody. This is going to be a time of year where there's a lot going on, and there could be a lot of new information coming out. So we won't be going so long for the next meeting, and I would say certainly within the next 2 to 4 weeks, we'll be back on with another PAC again as well. So great to see everybody. We had a taste of spring to come today, and it's going to get cold again, but we know that it's just going to continue to be warmer and more sunny, and good things will happen. So take care, everybody, and have a great evening. It's great to see you. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.